plans, programs, and initiatives that are going on countywide. Our first speaker, Tejash Sanchala, is the Executive Director of the Westchester County Human Rights Commission. The Westchester County Human Rights Law is designed to protect Westchester County residents, employees, and visitors from discrimination in employment, housing, public accommodation, and in addition to investigating, conciliating, and adjudicating claims, the Commission is committed to education and outreach initiatives throughout Westchester County. They provide programs and services to employees, employers, schools, service clubs, and organizations that foster education awareness and understanding of diversity, unity, and humanity. So I'm going to ask Tejash to take over right now, and love to hear what you're going to say. Go right ahead.
Thank you so much, Mel. I appreciate you inviting me here today, and I'm honored to be here with Legislator Smith and my good friend Mayo Bartlett, and with your group. It's really fantastic to see so many groups like this throughout the county, and the enthusiasm and the interest in talking about social justice and racism and hate at this important time. So what I'm going to do is share my screen for a quick PowerPoint, and then I'm happy to answer any questions after Legislator Smith and Mayo have done their presentation as well. Let me see if I can share. Did it work?
Yep.
All right. Okay. So does it show up in PowerPoint, or does it show up in just the whole screen?
PowerPoint.
Oh, all right. So then I'll just do.
Well, I think we have the whole screen, but
You have the whole
we're
screen.
seeing the preview as well.
So yeah, you'll just have to start your show. And actually, before you start your show, I know Matt Slater has to hop on to another meeting. Matt, is there anything you quickly want to share with the group before you have to jump off?
Not specifically. I'm here just to listen and to learn and to hear the presenters tonight. Again, thank everyone for organizing, and just happy to be here.
Thanks. Yep. And if you just want to start your show, then you'll be able to share, and we'll see it as a slideshow.
Okay. So it says from beginning. So I've hit start slideshow. I can't see the screen that you're seeing. Is it starting or no?
It is not.
It is not. That was the sense I got from the silence.
It came up with the message resume, and
So-
maybe you needed to click that as well.
What you should do is probably stop sharing, and then set it up so that it's already going, and then start sharing again.
Okay. How about that?
Perfect.
Okay. Thanks so much. It's a little hard. I feel like I'm flying without being able to see what you guys can see. So I want to say, I was very happy to get an invitation from Mel. Mel and I have known each other for, I think, almost 20 years, 15 years, when we worked on a lot of disability rights cases before joining the commission. I joined the commission. I was honored to join the Human Rights Commission as executive director in 2019 after the county executive was elected. But prior to that, I practiced for 20 years doing discrimination law, primarily in the county. And Mel and I had the privilege to work on some cases together. So what I was talking about before is, I think it's clear to most people on this call that we're going through a racial reckoning in our country. And there's an epidemic of hate in our country. So I like to think that the commission's work is more important than ever. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what the Human Rights Commission does, talk about some of the issues involving discrimination that have been affecting the community by COVID. And then, like I said, I'm happy to answer any of your questions. So I want to let everybody know, since last March, our offices have remained open every day. I'm in the office almost every day. And we are available by phone, by email, and we will meet with somebody in person if necessary. So if somebody in the community needs our assistance, we're happy to be a resource. And I'm happy to say that we are a resource to the community. Did it go to slide 2?
No, it's still on the initial one.
Oh, actually, do you see in the oh, there you go.
Now it's moving.
So is what slide are you seeing on right now?
Examples of discrimination.
in
Yeah,
employment
all right.
in
So
places of-
let me go back a few. You're getting a few pieces. Okay. So Mel said some of these things on the second slide. And then I realized that sounds awfully familiar. Then I realized Mel was reading our website. And I said, I do believe I'm familiar with that writing. So a couple of the takeaways, I do tell people I would love to be put out of business and not have to do these types of issues. But I think recent events show us that I have, we have more than enough to handle in the areas of discrimination in employment, housing, public accommodations, and credit lending. The commission's jurisdiction was not always countywide. That is something that was added later on, but we do have jurisdiction throughout the county in fair housing matters and in employment and public accommodation matters. The law went into its effect in 2000 on the employment side, and we became a partner with HUD in 2008. So we are a partner with the federal agency in housing discrimination matters for the last 12 years. Last year was our 20th anniversary. We probably would have had a big gala. That hasn't happened. So I'm hoping for an event that's maybe 21 and 21. So we'll see. I want to give you a sense of our team. I like to tell people we have a small but mighty team. We have a team of 6. You'll see the personnel on the side. Below me is Valerie Daniele. She actually worked as a trial attorney at HUD for 11 years. See Joshua Levin. He was an administrative law judge at the New York State Division of Human Rights. Was able to steal him back from State Division. And Diane Ballesteri has been a long-term investigator in our office. And John Baker has extensive experience in fair housing investigations. And Natalia Sanchez Barr, if you call our office, that's who's going to answer our phone. She's Spanish speaking, and we try to reach as many people as we can. You'll also see we have a board of directors. We have a commission board, and that's led by Reverend Doris Dalton and Reverend Dr. Stephen Pogue, who's the vice chair. I put the other names on the list so you could see who the other members of the commission are. They all play a very important role in our agency's function. So in addition to enforcing the fair housing law and the human rights law, we do a significant amount of education. And as I say, we have a robust education program. Since the murder of George Floyd, I want to say we had over 8 programs that we participated in. And I just want to talk about a couple of them. Last July, I think we had a program with elected officials, including Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins, Mayor Sean Patterson Howard, Greenberg Town Councilman Ken Jones, and Mayo actually spoke on that panel as well to talk about the criminal justice system. And I think the first step in addressing any issue is acknowledging racism. And you're seeing now there's a greater awareness. And I'm having a lot of conversations with people now that they're aware of things today that they were not aware of last year or 2 years ago. So that was our kickoff program. We've had other programs talking about how to have conversations on race with your family and friends without it really digressing into a shouting match or an arguing match, or where we say, you know what, I'm not going to agree with you. You're not going to change my mind. I'm not going to change your mind. Let's just not talk about it. But I think dialogue is so critical on these types of issues. So that program talked about the White Ally Toolkit method created by David Campt. We also talked about mitigating implicit bias and allyship strategies from the majority community to a minority community, but also from a minority community to another minority community, and within the same minority community, because we all know colorism and discrimination within communities also exist. That program was done by Reverend Dr. Bryant Marks, who worked in President Obama's White House. And then we did a series of bystander intervention trainings. So to empower the community to learn skills. If you see somebody being harassed on the street, in the supermarket, in school, what can you do to be an upstander, and how can you assist your fellow community member? We'll probably do some more similar programs like that this year. I'm working on organizing the set of programs. I encourage you to follow our Facebook page. I think it's at Westchester County HRC, and you'll get a list of the programs as they come up. So the 4 areas that we primarily protect under our law are housing, employment, places of public accommodation, and credit lending. I'm going to give you some examples where we go through some of those later tonight. Okay, so this is where I think some people are a little bit surprised to learn about our office. Our laws have approximately 17 protected categories, from age, national origin, religion, creed, race, color, disability. There's some of them, they may seem, sure, I'd expect them to be covered, but there's a couple that I just want to talk about. Is sexual orientation. That's been covered by the county's human rights law since 1999, since its inception. It's only recently been covered by federal law and a few years ago under state law. For many years, the county's human rights law has included protection against discrimination based on gender identity and gender expression. And it includes protections against alienage and citizenship status, which the federal law and the state law do not. So I'm going to walk you through an example later on how that would apply. So let me give some examples about where you might see some types of discrimination in employment and places of public accommodation. So the first example is Jane has been sexually harassed on her job for the past 6 months in Westchester County. This topic has been in the news quite the past few days, but it's also, been in the news for the past couple of years with the Me Too movement. As an attorney who's litigated many of these cases and handled many of these types of cases, it's important. It's optimistic that people are coming forward and feeling comfortable that they can report these incidents. And we do education outreach to let people know if they are being sexually harassed in their job, that they can come to our office and pursue a complaint if they so choose and they have jurisdiction. The second scenario is John was not hired for a job because of their sexual orientation. So if there's in the course of a job interview, it's determined that an interviewer is asking inappropriate questions, or the person is not selected for what John believes is based on sexual orientation, that individual would have the ability to file a complaint with our office, and we do an investigation. The third one is also somewhat timely. Helen has refused service in a restaurant because she's perceived to be Chinese. And in the beginning of the pandemic, you were seeing businesses which might be concerned about not providing services to individuals who are Chinese. And in Westchester County, they might not have wanted to provide services to individuals in New Rochelle, because that was where the earlier epicenter was. And the important point here to bring up is, A, that's unlawful under the human rights law, but B, if Helen is not Chinese, and say Helen is Korean, or Helen is from Thailand or from somewhere else, or she's Filipino, but she's perceived as Chinese, that's still unlawful under our law. The perpetrator does not get a free pass because they're wrong about somebody's identity. Our human rights law protects against discrimination based on actual and perceived identity. So let's talk a few examples of housing discrimination. This is also somewhat timely. In the first example, Maria is sexually harassed by apartment building superintendent. Just like an individual has the right to be free from sexual harassment in their employment, they have the right to be free from sexual harassment in their housing. So if the superintendent is stalking, is propositioning, is maybe conditioning repairs on certain types of, on a sexual relationship or romantic relationship, that could be unlawful under the Fair Housing Law and the Westchester County Fair Housing Law. And it may go another step. If Maria, in this example, was telling her management company or her landlord, hey, this is what the superintendent's doing to me, and it's not getting corrected, it's not getting remedied, it may be a violation of the Fair Housing Law as to them as well. Second example is John's rental application was denied because he has a housing choice voucher, more commonly known as Section 8. This is one of those examples where people still sometimes may overtly discriminate. you may see a job, not a job posting, but an advertisement for an apartment where it says no Section 8 accepted, no programs accepted, no working programs accepted. Those are all unlawful, in terms of discrimination based on Section 8. The statute's called lawful source of income. Section 8 is the basis of lawful source of income. So there's some exceptions, but I'm just giving you the general highlights. The third example is also timely. I tried to pick examples of things that are quite frankly on my desk or things of people that I've been speaking to about. Is there's an eviction moratorium right now. Landlords can't evict anybody. So what have I heard some landlords may be doing is saying, one, if you don't leave by tomorrow or day after tomorrow, I may call ICE. So you might want to suggest moving. You might want to suggest leaving. And that could be a basis for discrimination based on alienage and citizenship status that we were talking about. The last example on this slide talks about Kelly's request for an emotional support animal. So if an individual lives in a co-op, condo, an apartment building, and they have a disability, and they believe they need an emotional support animal, they can make that request, and it's called a reasonable accommodation. The housing provider has to engage in an interactive dialogue and discuss whether that reasonable accommodation for emotional support animal can be granted or not. The example here is they denied it without any consideration. So that would be unlawful. There needs to be an interactive process for it. This is one of the larger number of cases that our office gets. So I've given a number of presentations. I keep these 2 slides in because I think I did this last April and they're still timely. So I want to talk about where there was some housing discrimination related to COVID. And in the beginning days, we were seeing some frontline doctors who were being told by their apartment landlords, you know what, I don't want you in this building. I don't want you here because you're going to bring COVID into the building. You're not sick, but I perceive you as having a disability or having COVID in their eyes. So you're not permitted. We saw that with long haul truck drivers who are driving through certain states. We're seeing that less now, but that was something that was early on and I wanted to bring to people's attention. And then the second slide is what precipitated one of the examples I talked about before is some landlords are reportedly taking advantage of tenants who are in a vulnerable position, saying, wink, wink, there are other ways you can pay your rent. And I know one Human Rights Commission agency had received 10 complaints in a short time period about that. And we're hearing stories about that as well. So what are some other areas of discrimination that you may have seen in the pandemic? These are things that you probably read about in the news, and I think that are well known to most people, but I felt I wanted to highlight it so we could talk about it today. We obviously are all well know about the disparate health impacts in the Black and Brown community between how the virus has impacted them. And more recently, I think New York City has had a number of stories about vaccine equity and distribution as well. Second piece is gender disparities. Last month, Vice President Kamala Harris had written an op-ed in the Washington Post talking about how there's a national emergency, that more than 2.5 million have left the work, more than 2.5 million women have left the workforce. And that's something that we need to make a concerted effort for them to come back to the workforce. I mentioned ableism and ageism because this is something that was also early on in the pandemic. Some of you may remember, we had a shortage of ventilators. We had a shortage of hospital rooms. And all of a sudden, people felt comfortable having conversations about who deserves a ventilator, who deserves a hospital room, who deserves a doctor's appointment. Should we waste, quote unquote, this ventilator on somebody who has a disability? Should we waste this ventilator or this hospital room on somebody who's over 60? Shouldn't we have it and go to somebody who's younger and quote unquote healthier? And so we're starting to see those types of scenarios. And if somebody experiences discriminatory conduct by a medical provider in Westchester within the past 1 year, they could bring a claim to our office. The last one I think is just, they're all sad, but the last one is, the pandemic made it difficult is survivors of domestic violence were in essence trapped in the homes with their abusers. and they couldn't go out. And so there have been a reported increase in number of domestic violence issues, and our human rights law and fair housing law prohibit discrimination against somebody based on their status as a domestic violence survivor, stalking survivor. So I wanted you to all know that. And the county had also passed a law, I believe a year or two ago, called the Safe Time Leave Law. And that provides 40 hours of paid leave for survivors of domestic violence based on certain categories. So if you have any questions about that, I'm very accessible. Feel free to call me, or you can I'm happy to answer any questions. Okay, how do you file a complaint with our office? If the last alleged discriminatory act occurred within the past 1 year in Westchester County in employment, housing, place of public accommodation, or in credit lending, you could file a complaint with our office, provided it meets one of the categories that I talked about. We have jurisdiction. So what happens if somebody files a complaint? We take the complaint. We are a neutral agency. So that means we take the complaint. We are not an advocate for the individual who's the complainant, and we're not an advocate for the respondent. We will ask for information from the respondent, do an investigation. If we determine there's probable cause that discrimination occurred, the matter will be referred to a hearing. And I thought it was important for you to see on this page, what are the remedies that somebody can obtain after they are successful after a hearing and discrimination is found. They could obtain injunctive relief. They could obtain remedial action. They could obtain monetary damages for emotional distress, for doctor's visits. They could obtain punitive damages in certain cases, and their attorneys can be reimbursed for their reasonable attorney's fees if they're successful. And there's some civil monetary penalties and reporting obligations that can be collected as well. But,
I'm going to have to ask you to wrap about a minute or so.
Yep. All right. I'm going to really quick. So we talked about the virus doesn't discriminate. I want to just talk really quickly about what the issue that's been in the news quite a bit. There have been 3,000 incidents of hate across the country against Asian Americans. Those are the number of incidents that we know about. There's a significant underreporting of hate incidents throughout the country. If you leave with anything here tonight, what I'd like to tell you is, if you see a hate incident, report it to the Human Rights Commission. If you see a hate crime, report it to the local police department. If you're not sure, report it to the police and err on side, but report it to us as well. Just this number, I want to just share. If you take 3,000 incidents against Asian Americans nationwide, divide that by 365 days, that's 8 incidents on the average per day. That's 1 every 3 hours that our Asian American community members are being attacked based on political rhetoric, misinformation, and anger based on the pandemic. There's some other things I want to talk about, but I want to give time for the other 2 panelists to speak and cede my time now.
Thanks a lot. That's a very informative presentation, and it gives us some things that we could do locally if we see those kind of events taking place. Our second speaker is Mayo Bartlett. He's a civil rights attorney and activist. He also serves, and I'm not using the term served in the past, as the co-chair of Westchester County Police Reform and Reimagining Task Force, which has recently issued a report with 51 recommendations originating from 6 working groups. Welcome, Mayo, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Mel. Thank you for having me. And it's always difficult to follow Tejash because he presents so much information and with a ton of proficiency and passion. I'm very happy to come and talk to you a bit about what we're doing, and Legislator Smith has played an integral role, as has Tejash, in the Westchester County Police Reform and Reimagining Task Force. So they both have lent their talents in tremendously valuable ways. And I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about what we've done, how we got there, and also just reiterate the fact that it's an ongoing process, as everything we do is. And if you just go back and imagine watching an old Western or a 50s piece, something where you're looking at an antique car, you're looking at Little House on the Prairie with people, living without electricity. And imagine if they simply stayed there and they didn't move forward, and they didn't say, hey, you know what, we can improve. And not that everything that came after is always better, but I look at all of the things we're talking about in terms of, I've heard it stated by a number of different groups, but I've heard it attributed as a Kenyan proverb and also as a Native American proverb, that we do not inherit the world from our ancestors, but instead we borrow it from our children. And if we look at things that way, then we're almost guaranteed to have to consider those who are going to follow in our footsteps and those who are going to have to live with the decisions that we make. So as we started to work on the police reform and reimagining task force, it really was the brainchild of George Latimer. And he thought to do this before the Executive Order 203, which came from Governor Cuomo. And in my estimation, really allowed us to have conversations that are essential. And I think that we probably had a bit of an advantage doing it before it was required, because there was no pressure to start to do something that we hadn't already considered. But that being said, I'm working with several other municipalities for their task force efforts. And I have presented to many more. And one thing that I find is that quite often you will hear from some people on the task forces, and we did not hear this in Westchester. If it did occur, I didn't hear it, is that the only reason we're doing this is because the governor's requiring it. And just go back to when you were in school. Imagine somebody saying, the only reason we have to learn mathematics is because this teacher is requiring us to do so. Only reason I have to learn English or the only reason I have to learn about world history is because someone's making me do it. And it makes me go back to the term amateur. And when you look at amateurs, it's someone who's doing something for the love of whatever it is they're doing. And invariably, those people bring a passion to what they're trying to do. And some of the best professionals were amateurs before they became professionals. So in my estimation, whether you chose to do it on your own, whether it's a begrudging effort, or whether it's something that is embraced wholeheartedly in response to the governor's Executive Order 203, I look at this as an opportunity for communities to reevaluate where they actually are. It's an opportunity to have an assessment of what you're doing. Now, I happen to do a lot of television now, and I used to do a show every week. Now it's a little less than that, but I'm frequently on television or radio. And I remember the first time I heard my voice, and I said, who is that? It didn't sound like me. I didn't think that's what I sounded like, but that's exactly what I sounded like. That's what everybody else in the world heard. Okay, so it made me stop, and it made me aware that I am not always perceived as I intend to be perceived. And that if I want to be the very best that I can be, that means that I have to take a step back. I have to listen to people, and not just those who I think have similar thoughts, because then chances are I'm not expanding my horizons, and I'm going to end up not being the best that I could possibly be. So I think that it's an opportunity for us to look at our police department. It's an opportunity for us to get to know our officers in smaller communities in particular. And it's a chance to look at, and we paid particular attention to the concept of reimagining what police should do and where they should be and when we should need them. And it's also an opportunity. I've found that the police officers that I've worked with have really embraced the process, and they've contributed in ways that you would never have expected. And it's not to say that I didn't think they would participate, but they shared things that I had no idea about as a former prosecutor for 11 years and somebody that's been in criminal justice for nearly 3 decades. And I was learning things every day. And then I learned things that, hey, as an assistant district attorney, I didn't go out and make an arrest. I didn't have to worry about that part of it. I dealt with other concerns that some of the police didn't deal with, but that was a side of it I didn't have to think about. I didn't work double shifts, didn't interfere with my relationship with my family. And we learned a lot. We learned that nobody wants better police than police. We learned that, especially if you're a good officer. If you're a good officer, a bad officer may cost you your life. As a matter of fact, if you remember the shooting in Dallas, It wasn't in response to anything that happened in Dallas. It was a response to something that happened halfway across the country. And who got shot? An officer that had nothing to do with it. So bad officers hurt all officers, just as people who do things that are egregious in the community hurt the whole community. I think that we were able to look at things like officer wellness through Project ABLE, which is active bystandership in law enforcement. And I have a budding friendship with the one of the primary people responsible for ABLE, Jonathan Aroney, who was the federal monitor from the New Orleans Police Department. And ABLE came out of another project called EPIC, which recognized the atrocities down in New Orleans after Katrina, when many Black and brown people were shot and killed when they tried to flee the flooding and go into other communities that historically they weren't welcome in. And Jonathan Aroney was the federal monitor for the New Orleans Police Department. And his law firm actually put money into it, I think $100,000 at the time, and started EPIC. And eventually they went to Georgetown Law School, and Georgetown Law bought into it entirely. And now they're moved on to ABLE, which I think is a great evolution beyond EPIC. So in Westchester County, our police academy already focused on EPIC, which deals with how we interact with the community. But now we've agreed also to go and embrace ABLE. ABLE does things like empower lower ranked officers to intervene if they see transgressions from people higher than they are in the department, including all the way up to the chief. So if you look at George Floyd, which was in many respects the impetus for what we're doing, and that's with the caveat that in Westchester County, there are George Floyds, and there are George Floyds throughout the United States. But that's the one that was the catalyst for us to actually begin this work. Officer Chauvin, who killed George Floyd and knelt on his neck, was the training officer. He's the guy that the rookies go to find out how to do the job. So how do you expect a 1 or 2 week veteran, if you can call a person that, to confront the person that trains them? And so because these officers, 2 of whom were on the job for 2 weeks or less, didn't act, they now find themselves charged. Well, the first thing is that Mr. Floyd lost his life unnecessarily. And in the worst case scenario, he passed a bad bill, a $20 bill. The next tragedy is that now all of them are facing criminal charges, loss of their careers, possibly loss of their liberty. And in addition to that, created chaos throughout the United States. So when we look at how that could have been done differently, if ABLE had been implemented, it would have empowered those officers. In fact, it would have been fresh in their minds because they would have just come out of the academy having just completed that training. And they would have said, you know, you can't stay on his neck, get off of his neck. And if he didn't comply, they were empowered to get him off of the neck without fear of reprisal. And I think that that's huge. And there were a couple of examples that were given when we give the presentation from ABLE, which is, by the way, free of charge. ABLE is to me one of the best examples of a private-public partnership. It's one where we have, and we're very fortunate in our area to have, huge corporations, multinational corporations that are leaders in their industry. MasterCard, Verizon, and Pepsi have funded this. So if you decided you wanted it to come to Yorktown, it doesn't cost Yorktown any money. The only cost would be if Yorktown says, okay, we have to maybe lose overtime for someone. But the benefit versus that 1 day or 2 days of overtime or whatever it may end up being is tremendous. One of the examples was an officer who was beloved by everyone in the community, as well as the people in the department. And the two are not always the same. And he was going through something. He wasn't quite himself, wasn't up to par, wasn't conducting business as he normally would, but nobody said anything to him. Everybody liked him. No one wanted to nitpick. And one day he made an arrest and he didn't cuff the guy correctly. And by not cuffing that guy correctly, the man was able to gain access to someone's weapon and shot and killed one of his colleagues, one of his officers. And so he'll probably never get beyond that, you know, himself. Sometimes it's easier to forgive others than yourself. And also this other person's dead. it didn't need to happen. And the other officers noticed that he hadn't cuffed him properly. Another is somebody who's going through a divorce. They're not in their right mind. And their fellow officer says, you know what? You should take today off. You don't seem like you're really ready to give 100%. And for each of us, we all hopefully wake up saying we want to give 100%. And on one day, 100% is something other than it is on another day. One day, maybe you're sick. One day, maybe you haven't had a chance to eat. One day, maybe you've lost a loved one and that's on your mind. You may still give 100%, but 100% today might be 85, 100% tomorrow might be 90. But recognizing that for a law enforcement officer, the mistakes they make are perhaps the greatest mistakes, because they, like a doctor that's on a surgery table, can lead to someone's loss of life, someone's loss of liberty, or in the best case scenario, just a bad interaction where maybe they're just rude to people all day. And, you know, the officers, every single officer is an ambassador for their fellow officers. Doesn't matter whether they choose to be, just as all of us are ambassadors for our community. So if someone comes to Yorktown and they meet one of you and they say, wow, I really had a great interaction with that person. That Mel Tansman's a great guy. You know, let's go back to Yorktown, because all of a sudden Mel is everybody in Yorktown, right? And we start to look at it that way. On the other hand, if Mel has a really bad interaction with them, they probably don't want to come back to Yorktown. So how does that impact Yorktown? Maybe you shop someplace else. Maybe you go to Peekskill instead of going to Yorktown. Maybe you don't buy a house there. Maybe you tell other people bad things about it. So we may not see how it hurts, but it ends up hurting everybody in the town. And if we do it the way it's supposed to be done, it benefits everybody in the town. So that was just one of the things that we looked at. We started out looking at how somebody becomes an officer, with the recognition that qualifications and recruitment is pivotal. And how have we been recruiting officers, and what are we looking for in officers? So are we looking for somebody that's invested in procedural justice? And that means somebody that's not going to bring bias with them to the job, with the understanding that we all have our affinities and we all have our prejudices. However, are we able to leave that at the door and do the job as it should be done? And to me, the blueprint there is a firefighter. I have never heard of somebody that I'm aware of being told by the firefighter, I'm not putting your fire out because I don't like you guys. The firefighter may hold that in their heart. You'll never know. And the firefighter will be in your house, and after they think they get everyone out, if the little baby thinks that there's a cat inside, that firefighter's probably going back into the house. So that's an example of how you leave any other feelings you might have at the doorstep. And generally, if you ask people, are they pleased with their fire department? They're probably among the most highly regarded people in the community. And their brothers that are police may not be. And sometimes it's based upon perception. It's not always based upon the actuality. So is the appearance an appearance of impropriety? So if, for instance, I'm at a Black Lives rally and I may be doing everything appropriately. I'm not treating anybody poorly. I'm just doing my job. But then next week at the Back the Blue rally, I'm giving high fives and I'm taking pictures with people and I'm the police officer. That sends a message to my community. If they are in favor of the Back the Blue, they feel that they're at home. And if they're not, they may not. And it's an unnecessary division. It's creating a divide between the law enforcement and the community. And I think that our task is to find ways to build bridges, not just in law enforcement, but across the board, because we're dividing ourselves in a way that no enemy of the United States would be able to do. I mean, if they could simply do this, they wouldn't even invest in military, just come in and have us more or less attack each other and shout each other down. So as we look at that, we look at how can we diversify departments? And I focus on diversify because at one point I thought that the department should look like the community. But then I had what I consider to be a bit of an epiphany that there are some departments that look very much like the community. Maybe the department is mostly Black and the community is mostly Black. is that necessarily what I want? Do I necessarily want to have 25 Black officers in a 90% Black community, or do I benefit from having someone who's not African American? If I'm in a majority white community, do I really want to have 25 white officers? And do I want them all to be male? Or do I benefit from diversity? Do I benefit from diverse opinion? Do I benefit by having someone who may be able to interact with a different segment of the community a bit better? Do I benefit by not just focusing on the people who, quote unquote, are citizens or residents of my community, with the realization that when people go to the JV Mall, you don't want it to be limited to people from Yorktown. You want everyone to be able to come here and spend their money there. And if they think they're going to get a different level of justice, they probably won't. So justice should be the same for anyone who comes into our communities. I'm going to be mindful of the time, so I'm going to move on a bit more. Mel, roughly how much time do you think I have?
Yeah, I would say it should happen about 2 minutes, actually.
Okay, I'm going to go through it really quickly. We moved from qualifications and recruitment to what kind of training we have. We've been very fortunate. The Westchester County Department of Public Safety trains all of the departments in Westchester, and they do more than is required by the state. And in fact, Westchester County has 50%, only 50% of our municipality police departments are accredited by the state. And when you leave Westchester, only 25%. So if you drive up to Lake George, you may be passing through one or more communities that do not have accredited police departments. That means that you don't know what to expect in terms of the proficiency of the officers there. And it's not a knock on the individual officers, but it's looking at the training that they may have received or perhaps did not receive. And the shared services. We have 43 municipalities that have different police departments. It's an opportunity here for us to look at ways we can come together to share the burden of training, the way that we can look at how we deal with people with mental health issues, and perhaps have shared services with regional teams, much as we would with a SWAT team, where we can have embedded mental health professionals and perhaps members of our adjoining communities, each donating officers with special training on de-escalation and how to interact with people with mental health issues, and perhaps using crisis stabilization teams, which are not law enforcement based, that can just have general well-being checks, so that we don't reach the point where the police are now being asked to be mental health professionals, which they more often than not are not and did not sign up for. And when it goes south, we then blame them. And I think that we have to mature a bit more to look at that part of it. We went from that to policies and procedures, which make sure that we're implementing the training, and then accountability, which means that if somebody engages in a transgression or doesn't follow their training, that there'd be a manner in which we can openly and honestly and transparently have accountability. And toward that end, Westchester County has proposed an Office for Police Accountability, which would take the burden away from individual departments from having to do the disciplining themselves. And almost every department I've talked to has expressed an interest, and more importantly, the rank and file officers would rather have their case heard in the county by an independent body with subpoena power that's a co-equal branch of government with the county exec and the county board of legislators than to have it meted out in their own smaller community. And that's for several reasons, and I'll end on this note. Not every officer has the same relationship within the department. There are officers who have been whistleblowers who may have fallen out of favor, and if they were relying on their own department to determine their disciplinary procedure, they probably wouldn't have a great outcome. And if you just go back and ask yourself about Serpico, those of you who remember Serpico, the police officer who was the whistleblower and got shot in an assassination attempt by his own officers, I don't think he'd want to have his officers decide whether he was innocent. So there's a lot more to talk about, and I just love to thank you so much for having us. And now I would look forward to listening to my good friend and colleague, Colin Smith. So thank you very much, Mel. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, Mayo. We're going to move quickly to Colin. Colin Smith is the county legislator representing the 1st District, which includes parts of Yorktown. He chairs the legislators' Public Safety Committee. Colin, thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Mel, for having me, and Thank you all for joining this evening and inviting me to speak. And thank you for putting me after Tejash and Mayo. I appreciate that because it means two things. One, I know my time is limited, so I can say just about anything in 2 or so minutes. But in reality, I have to say that Tejash certainly must have been the student that, what did I say? That there was a reason for the curve or broke the curve or something. I mean, I loved the presentation. And in fact, if you wouldn't mind forwarding that to me at some point, I would appreciate it. But I learned some things tonight, during the presentation. And Tejash and I have only recently gotten to know one another over the last year. And of course, most of that time has been while we've been dealing with COVID. So I was not able to attend the 20th anniversary celebration, but I know we will make up for that at some point. And I'll just say, my good friend Mayo, and it's you talk about how things come full circle in life. I met Mayo when I was a law student back in '99. I was a member of the African American Law Students Association, and Mayo was you were the advisor, or you were you came and spoke. But Mayo was at the time he was working at the Westchester County District Attorney's Office. He was chief of the bias crime unit. But Mayo was just somebody who was just always involved in the community, in this particular instance with law students, and we developed a fast friendship. And we see each other in court from time to time, and of course, most recently, we've had the opportunity to work together on the county's police task force. And so, I just want to say that under his leadership and that of Leroy Frazier, who is not on the call this evening, that they've done a tremendous job in pulling together these recommendations into what perhaps some of you have seen is a very informative report, 178 pages worth. And we are in the process now at the Board of Legislators of going through each of the working group recommendations. And of course, Mayo has been involved in each step of that. So it's really it's an honor to be here amongst such good company. I was just skimming through one of the part of the email chain going back and forth leading up to this about the forum, and I know at least in part you wanted to devote some time to talk about what government is doing to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and that's obviously what we have been talking about here. And I think Tejash really laid out, even though it is coming from the perspective of the Human Rights Commission, he really did touch on, broad strokes, really sort of the major issues that we deal with here in Westchester County, and that they deal with all over, but we're here in Westchester. So I'll speak briefly to a couple of things. Being involved in police reform and reimagining task force, obviously we are engaged in assembling our final report as every municipality is. And just the purpose of this, in my view, is to address the structural and institutional deficiencies, with regards to race, with regards to gender, with regards to sexual identity, with regards to ethnicity, with regards to religious background, that exists in the interactions, and that color, the interactions between law enforcement and the communities. Obviously, we see those shortcomings, those deficiencies, those problems most poignantly in the interaction between law enforcement and our communities of color. And as we all know, it was the killing of George Floyd, which really tipped off this most recent wave of reforms. But that was he was really just a symptom of a much deeper problem, and it's not just about, it's not solely about violence visited by law enforcement on African Americans and other persons of color in our country, in our state, in our county. But that certainly is a large chunk of it. But there's systemic issues that also obviously are needing to be addressed as a result of that. And Mayo really laid out, I think, very succinctly what many of those are when we're talking about recruitment, when we're talking about training, when we're talking about accountability. I was a member of the accountability working group at the county, and we had some very definitive recommendations for how we think the county should move forward in response to, with respect to that. But those are things that have to be addressed. It's also true that there's law enforcement is the Department of Public Safety here in Westchester has been very they've worked quite well with us in this regard, and I've made personally I've tried to make a real effort to make myself available and have a dialogue with our police commissioner, with the heads of our police and law enforcement unions, because although we may not see eye to eye on every issue, we may not always come down on the same side of the coin. We have to deal with each other. We have to work with one another, and we have to find a way to do that. That regardless of the differences we might have, is going to help and not hurt our residents, our constituents. And so that's obviously something that is a work in progress. And we have several more meetings to go before we wrap up the process at the county level. And then after that, we will begin the process of taking a look at which of these reforms take priority and will be the first ones to begin to work on. With respect to equity as it relates to housing, I always hesitate wading into this conversation, not because it's one that I don't like to talk about. It's just there's a lot of moving parts when we talk about the disparities in housing, or the housing crisis, or however you want to call it, the shortage of affordable housing here in Westchester County, because it doesn't land on every community the same. And how the city council in Peekskill addresses this issue isn't the same as how the Yorktown board addresses the issue, because they are not, there's differences that, have to be taken into account. That said, as I'm sure many of you know, and Mel, I know this is something that is really, this is in your wheelhouse. The county received a favorable report recently from the housing monitor as a result of the consent decree entered into, I believe it was in 2008 or 9, between the county and HUD. I think what we've seen is substantial compliance with respect to the housing matter, the number of housing units that were required. And that's a good thing. And I think that the monitor's report, speaks well of the county in that regard. Of course, there's still, there's still areas throughout the county that we need to address this issue more poignantly and with greater urgency. And it's a delicate issue, more delicate in some areas than in others. But the county is certainly committed, and I could see the comment there from Ken Belfer. Yes, there's some areas that of course fall outside the having done their part, so to speak. And so I think, I know that the county executive, the Board of Legislators are committed to addressing these issues. Obviously, the housing, the affordable housing shortage or the housing crisis, or just the shortage of affordable housing in general, has been compounded by the pandemic, which, as somebody had, Tejash was talking about earlier, the moratorium on evictions is really stemmed, is really just stemming a tide or a wave of housing issues that's coming our way at some point. And so even people who were just making it, or were making it semi-comfortably perhaps before the pandemic, have now found themselves behind the 8 ball and potentially on the verge of losing their living spaces once things begin, when eventually the moratoriums will be lifted. So there's a lot of work. There's a lot of people who are working on how best to address that, and certainly we have to prepare ourselves for quite a challenge on our hands, because there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be struggling to find housing when the economy opens back up fully, whatever that may look like. So these are things that the Board of Legislators has been working on, that the county executive has been working on. Obviously, there's ramifications with respect to sort of the disparity in housing across demographic and racial and income lines, and we have to have all stakeholders, all of our partners on board, all hands on deck to meet this crisis head on. That includes not just the county, but the state and the federal government as well. And of course, working with the municipalities to ensure that our more vulnerable residents don't fall through the cracks. It's after 8 o'clock now. I could certainly go on and on, but I think we probably want to open up for some conversation or some questions. So I will leave it. I'll leave it there. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Okay, thank you, Colin. We got some questions, but before we do, I don't know how long, because we got off to a late start, we're kind of tight. But I'd like to ask Rachel from YFJ just to talk a little bit about some of the projects we're trying to do, so we can get some feedback from the guest speakers today. If we keep it short, we can probably get about 3 or 4 questions in after that. So Rachel, if you could.
I will be very short, Mel. First of all, I want to thank you, Mel, and everyone else from Yorktown for Justice for facilitating this forum and getting these wonderful panelists, and all of our panelists for joining us. This is really great. So I am representing Yorktown for Justice as one of the co-founders, and Mel mentioned our mission statement in the beginning of the talk as really being about bringing together community over the purposes of inclusion and equity. And the ways that we hope to do that are threefold: through our town government, through our school districts, and through our community culture and arts event programming. So community culture and arts event programming is really important because art is representative of who we are as a people. Art is our culture. We can meet each other through art. We can celebrate each other through art. So cultural awareness and celebration, they can be at the precipice of a social justice movement, leading with love and acceptance. So we work pretty hard to plan some art events in our community. Most recently, we led a quilting project. Quilting has long history in social justice, particularly for women and African Americans. So we led this community art project in which we gave out donated fabric baggies, and everybody was to make their own square representative of love, justice, kindness, in honor of Black history. So it could have been a figure from Black history. And we gave out about 70 quilt squares and got about 70 back. So we had about 100% return rate. And our quilt is going to be a public art piece that represents all of us and our views on equity, equality, diversity, and inclusion. And it's going to stand at the JV Mall and the library and possibly the museum, if we can work that out. Some other things that we are working on in terms of culture and arts is a film screening with a partnership with the John C. Hart Library, Race Amity, and the Yorktown Housing Board to screen a 3-part PBS film screening called Race, the Power of an Illusion, with a talk session after each screening. We are going to have Vinnie Bagwell as a guest speaker. And I don't know if you know who Vinnie Bagwell is, but she is a local sculptor from Westchester County. Some of her art is in the Hudson River Museum, and she has been putting her sculptures all over the place lately. So she has been so gracious enough to join us and talk about the benefits of public art. For Women's History Month, we're hoping to plan a charity drive in benefit of My Sister's Place and the Northern Westchester and Putnam Shelter for Women for victims of domestic abuse, and have a Girl Scout partnership with Yorktown Girl Scouts in which they will research a woman of choice. And as you walk around the pavilion, you'll be able to walk around and see this gallery of Girl Scout-led women's history tributes. We're hoping to screen also in March a Netflix party, What the Constitution Means to Me, which is a play written by Heidi Schreck. And in April, we're going to focus on climate justice and participate in the Battle of Yorktown, which is a great effort in Yorktown to clean up our communities, screen an outdoor movie. In the future, we're hoping to get a mural up, have some public art around, and over the summer, we're hoping to plan another parade, hopefully in honor of Pride. Other things we want to work on: supporting our town government, obviously EO 203 and various committees on diversity and equity and inclusion. EO 203 is important to us as Yorktowners because Yorktown is a great town. We don't have a lot of the issues that you hear about, but you never want to hear about those issues. You never want to learn that your community isn't what you thought it was by something terrible happening. When you look at Westchester, most similarly to Yorktown, geographically, demographically, financially, and socioeconomically, is Mount Pleasant. And 10 years ago, there was a tragic murder of DJ Henry in Mount Pleasant at the hands of a law enforcement officer. So despite Mount Pleasant not being the kind of town one would think an EO 203 would necessitate, we have to take it just as seriously. So it is very important to us as Yorktowners. And I think that's just about it. I'm gonna drop 2 links in the chat. The first one is a link to our website. So if you're not on our mailing list, you can join it. And then the second one is a blog post about the upcoming event with Vinnie Bagwell. And that's going to be led by 2 community members also. And that's it for me.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm going to read some of the questions that we got tonight that Mike forwarded to me. This was an interesting one. There was a mention that many towns have groups similar to Yorktown for Justice. Is the county, or can any of the groups that have been presenting tonight do something to help bring these groups together to have, kind of like a council of groups? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
So I'll take a quick stab. There's certainly other municipalities, other communities that have groups similar to YFJ. And I think, especially over the course of the last year, they have been, much more active than in previous years. As far as, bringing people together to, whether it's to act in some sort of advisory capacity or just for the purpose of sort of getting a feel for, who's out there beyond, your own backyard and finding more ways to collaborate. I'm going to defer to Tejash on that to the extent that I think the human rights, I'm sorry, it's a little late. The Human Rights Commission is, I think can be a real focal point for that sort of activity. They work in our local communities with, I know they work with the Peekskill Human Rights Committee or Human Relations Committee, whatever they call it, and others to try and pull together members of their respective communities who want to address these issues. But that said, also the sky's the limit when it comes to this sort of thing. I mean, if you have a will and a desire to be involved in addressing issues of justice and equity, racism, sexism, and you have, all you need is one person. The county, well, I'm not going to speak for the county. Certainly, I am always a willing partner. I have had some conversations with members of your group in the past, and I'm hoping that we are going to be able to reconvene in the near future to discuss how, at least in our neck of the woods, we can do some work together to address these issues, because you can't, you can never talk about doing what's right too much, in my view.
Any of the other panelists have any thoughts on that? How about you, Tejas? Is that something that the Human Rights Commission might be interested in participating with us on, to bring folks together?
It's something I've been talking about, Mel, and thinking about how to do that. Obviously, with the pandemic, it's been a little bit difficult. So, and with the issues we've been addressing in the office, but it's something I'm looking into. One of the things I will say is there's a great value and a great service that Yorktown for Justice does, in the sense that it is hyper local to your community. And you are really plugged into the things that are happening in Yorktown. And so we're looking into if there's a way to connect other groups together, but a lot of different groups are working on things that are specific to their towns. But to the extent we're able to do that, I will circle back with you, Rachel and Mel. And I want to just give a plug out and say the programming that Rachel talked about is phenomenal. I was thoroughly impressed with all the programs that you guys are putting together. And my wife and I saw What the Constitution Means to You on Broadway right before the pandemic. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend that. And if it's too long for you, I'd watch the last 5 minutes between the debate between the main protagonist and the teenager.
If I may, I'd just like to make a suggestion. We started a coalition of not-for-profits maybe almost 20 years ago called We Are Westchester. And the goal was to sort of do what you're suggesting, bringing people together. And we talked about bringing people of different backgrounds, different affinities together, so that if something happened to one, they would never be alone. If one not-for-profit was struggling, they would be able to have access to support from their colleagues. But here, I think that there's an opportunity, certainly, to look at it regionally, and perhaps to do something countywide, and even going up into Putnam, where we've talked about having a film series. I think that you're already doing these things, but especially in the age of Zoom, it would be very easy to invite someone from Eastchester or from Yonkers or from New Rochelle to join you on a film series, or perhaps rotating who hosts, but having young people get involved as well, so that there's a network that's established, so that they can talk about what they're doing in their particular areas. And I agree, it's tremendous to be focused locally. However, if a neighbor or another municipality, especially one that's in our own county or in one of the neighboring counties, is doing something that would particularly be beneficial to you, it'd be great to have an access to that, and to perhaps even look at creating a library of materials and of experts you can turn to. We're talking about doing that with the police reform, that Westchester County will have a library of training documents, and we'll be able to share best practices throughout the county. And that doesn't mean that one of the smaller municipalities may not bring best practices back to the county. So I think it's a great idea looking at ways to expand. And even, well, we'll get into this a little while, but we're looking at regional solutions to things like mental health services and embedding officers with law enforcement. So there are a lot of ways we can be effective, and hopefully when things get back to normal, we can still take advantage of this format, which will allow us to reach more people.
Thanks. I think that was a very good explanation. The next question I got here is for Tejash. Are there any specific programs such as acknowledging racism or how to have conversations with your friends and family that HRC might be willing to do with sponsoring, co-sponsored by us? I think you're muted still, Tejash.
I am now. Yeah, I would absolutely willing to do a conversation or program with Yorktown for Justice. So we just have to think about what the topic would be applicable for your community. What do you think would really be most impactful and helpful? And sometimes, you know, conversations they run quite a range, because some people are at different spectrums in their journey on being an anti-racist. So I'm learning and talking to people in the last year or so, and they're saying, hey, Tejash, did you know there's this thing called structural racism? Did you know there's this thing called institutional racism? And I'm like, yeah, I've been aware of it. I'm like, pick a category, pick a sector, I could talk to you about it. And then there's some folks who've gotten the awareness and who are aware of certain things, but they're not sure what to do, and they want to do more. And then there's the category that's like, all right, I feel like I've done a training, I've done several trainings, and I'm ready to take the next step. What can I do in my community? So I'm always looking to see what type of program we can do that will focus on, if not all three of those communities, but certainly the folks in the middle. And in terms of guiding them. And, some of the conversations I have with people say, Tejash, why do you even bother trying to talk to somebody? You're never going to change their mind. You're never going to have that person's never going to agree with you, and you're not going to do it. And I think that's the wrong approach, because if you're familiar with the book called Rising Out of Hatred, it talks about Derek Black's journey out of the preeminent white supremacy family. He was Don Black's son and godson to David Duke. And he talks about when he went to college at 18 in Florida, he was homeschooled as a child. When he went to college, he met people who were different than him, and he had conversations, and he learned about their experiences. He got invited to Shabbat dinners, and they didn't talk about race. They didn't talk about other things, but they developed a human connection. And it took some time, but he talks about his journey away from a white supremacy family and a white supremacy history. And so is this something that will somebody change in a day, in a 2, in a week? No, but these are ongoing conversations, and they will take time. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to do our own homework and to look inward and see what improvements we can make in our lives. I always tell people is look at your friend circle. How diverse is your friend circle? Is everybody in your friend circle look like you? And by the way, when I say friend, I mean somebody you'd invite your house for dinner. I'm not talking about the person who mows your lawn, cleans your snow, is a cleaning person. I'm talking about who's actually coming to your house for dinner. And when I go to people's houses, one of the things I look at is their bookshelf. What are they reading? And how diverse are the books that they're reading? And what are the opinions that they're getting? So absolutely, it's a long-winded answer, but yeah, I think there may be a possibility to do some program. And I'm hoping to announce some of our programs up for the coming year soon. So if you see it on our Facebook page, and I'm very accessible, so feel free to email me or call me as well.
Right. I want to get to the third question, although I wanted to mention real briefly that Tejash and I have already talked about maybe April being Fair Housing Month and possibly having an educational forum about fair housing. But on to the next question. This is kind of a loaded question. I don't know what kind of response we're going to get. Have any of the panelists read the Yorktown Coalition for Public Safety recommendations? And have you any reaction or any comments about it?
Well, I did read it, and I haven't had a chance to read it in the manner in which it should be read, because I think that, I always like to read these reports more than one time so that I can see what exactly is there. And it doesn't give me an idea of how much time was put into it or what the process actually was. So, but other than that, I don't think I'm in a position to comment on it. But I
Okay,
certainly read it, and I try my best to read everyone. And it's interesting to see how they have different focal points.
okay. Any of the other panelists wish to say anything about that?
So I'll just respond and say, I have not read it. I have had conversations with people around it. And, some people have expressed some of their concerns with regards to what it may be lacking in from their perspective. But I have not read it. But I do just want to, point out that, and this perhaps means something. This doesn't perhaps mean the same thing in each municipality or in each situation. But these are, thank you, Rachel. These are roadmaps. These are not. It's not legislation. It's not even a policy enactment. It is a collection of recommendations. Now, of course, I know that when you're starting out on this, when we're talking about this issue of reform, reimagining and reform, like anything, the more you can set the tone up front, the more focused or directed you'll be. That said, not everybody's going to arrive at the same place with respect to this, the final document, the final report. And we could discuss how that happened and what should have took place, what shouldn't have took place. But I think don't forget also that this is just the beginning. And every municipality has its own report that they're generating, and of course the county has its own. And there will be time as we move forward. We will have opportunity to work together, whether it's regarding things that are related to the county or just local to Yorktown, because a lot of these issues overlap. And there's there are plenty of people who want to see real change, positive change in the right direction. And we just have to keep moving forward with that, even if this document itself doesn't necessarily reflect all of what we'd like to see in that regard. This isn't the final word on it. It's really, in my view, it just is sort of the preliminaries. It's a preliminary step to move in that direction.
I got a two-part question here. I know we've got to wrap soon, so I'm going to try to rush through them. For Mayo, what recommendations can you take from your work on the county task force that could help a smaller town like Yorktown? And also, after that, Colin, if you could just comment on the idea of the mobile crisis team around mental health and whether the county has the resources to do something like that. So why don't we start first with Mayo, and then we'll move on to you on those two questions.
I think that many of the concepts that we dealt with are universal, but of course, each community is a little bit different, and each community has its own unique needs and challenges. But I think that certainly the officer wellness component was important. I think the Office for Police Accountability would be pivotal, so that you'd be able to have transparency through the disciplinary process. And I found that working with some of the smaller departments, sometimes we're able to achieve even more. So one of the things that we've done with one of the other departments that I've worked with is we had a survey of the officers themselves. So they were able to anonymously critique their department, and also to have reverse, oh my goodness, my mind is going blank here, reverse evaluations, where the rank and file are able to also give an evaluation of the officers in the department. And if we do that, I think it yields some very, very interesting results. We found that there were some people who were defensive of the police with the anticipation that we were going to somehow be out to attack the police. And what I found most fascinating was quite often the police were less resistant than those individuals were. So they quite often don't understand what the police are really looking for. And I've had officers that were tremendously open and shared the fact that officer wellness in their eyes means not having to work, an 18-hour shift, so that they end up getting divorced and trying to raise, kids as a single father or mother. And those are things that we don't often talk about. We say we support law enforcement, and then you see it time in and time out that after the insurrection, there seemed to have a disappearance of people who supported law enforcement after law enforcement officers were killed and assaulted. And after 9/11, it also seemed to go away when they got sick after being down at ground zero, but there was no will to take care of them, just basic health care, let alone any other compensation. So I think that these are some steps I would take, and in particular, the survey of the officers themselves, because that'll give you a good feel of where the department actually is. And I think it would be I'm always surprised, put it that way, when I see the results of those surveys.
Okay. Colin, can you talk about, because it does come under public safety, I think somewhat, the idea of having a mental health crisis team to intervene when the police might not be as appropriate. Any thoughts on that, Colin?
Well, we could sit here for quite a while to talk about that one, Mel. I'll just say, I'll try and wrap this up succinctly in the time we have left. That was a major part of the discussions in the task force throughout many of the working groups, was the issue of mental health. Mayo touched on it from the law enforcement end with respect to officer wellness, but you're referring obviously to when law enforcement is called to the scene of someone who is dealing with a mental health crisis, and how that is, how do we find better, more appropriate and safer ways of dealing with that. And that comes down, of course, to a couple of different things, providing resources to our law enforcement officers, agencies, so that they are able to effectively deal with that, either by training. There's a recent program that has, recently there's been a program that we've been the county's been working with some of the local municipalities with regards to domestic violence, where they have phone ready professionals ready to speak to persons who are having a domestic violence crisis when the police show up. And I think that that's something that we could easily translate into a mental health component. I know there's been a good deal of conversation between myself and members of the town board in Yorktown about, as well as the chief of police, about restarting the mobile crisis unit, or some iteration, some version thereof. And I think all of that is on the table, right? And I think that it's really just a matter of sitting, of honing our policy with respect to that, and finding ways. There's a number of examples in different parts of the country of local municipalities that are utilizing their mental health professionals in conjunction with their law enforcement, and some to good effect. And so we want to be able to avail ourselves of that. We have a very robust Office of Mental Health here in the county, and they have taken on a tremendous amount of responsibility over this past year with COVID and many of the issues that have come ancillary to that. And so I know they stand ready to partner with us, and that's on deck. That is certainly a part of this reimagining and reform process, is how do we find better ways to support and empower our law enforcement to deal with people who are having mental health crises. And it's an ongoing conversation that we will continue to have.
And if I can just follow up very briefly on what Legislator Smith was saying, Westchester County already has crisis stabilization teams that are available. And if you contact the Department of Community Mental Health, that information can be made available. And we were looking at having regional hubs as a possible model where we'd be able to have 24-hour availability of mobile crisis teams, which could either come directly from the municipality, or in the case of smaller communities, perhaps we might have something where Cortland, Yorktown, and perhaps Croton come together along with Peekskill, and you each donate some officers to a part of a team, which is a standing team that's on call 24 hours a day, along with mental health professionals. And where appropriate, the mental health professional would be the point person. And where appropriate, that person would step back and allow law enforcement to be the point person. We've had some tremendous success with that in the past, and then it sort of went away due to budgetary constraints. And I believe that County Executive Latimer already committed to restoring some funding and to allow us to expand what we have in the county at this point. But the goal is to try to do that in a greater fashion. What we had explored, of course, it's not set in stone, was 6 regions in the county.
Great. I think rather than asking another question at this time, I know we're going over, but since we started about 10 to 15 minutes late, I figured we can go a little bit longer, but Mike suggested we do. Actually, Mike.
Hey, Mel, it's completely depending on the panelists and the participants. This is a private and paid room, so if we'd like, I mean, I just brewed a pot of coffee. We can stay till, 10:30, 11.
No,
however everyone would like.
They just never go.
We wanted to have, I know that you had suggested, and I think it's a great idea to have Alice as a member of our council who stayed with us through the night, say a few words or have a reaction to what she's heard. Alice?
Yeah, both Alice and Town Clerk Quach, who has stayed with us for the duration. I think it would be great to hear from both of them, and we appreciate your participation. And before that, I will say that Rachel did not discuss, one of the really important things that Yorktown for Justice has done so far in our community, which is educate. Yorktown is a community in its infancy of understanding, the systemic injustice that has been built for generations and centuries in society. And Rachel and Marissa, who's also on, and all the folks that have participated in YFJ have done a great job of bringing that education to our community. So we thank you for that.
I am grateful for your committee, and the good part about me is that I am leaving government at the end of the year, and hopefully I'll join your committee and do some work with you because I'd like to do that.
Alice, before you go on, we will find something for you to do. Trust us.
Good. But I want to.
Don't scare her off, Mike.
Mayo talked about, I think it was Mayo that said something that really touched me, because I think when you talk to people, particularly about systemic racism, people tend to want to back and be defensive, or at least in my community, they're defensive. And my feeling is that you don't teach you don't teach with hate. Because if there's hate on one side, you can't have hate on the other side. And I so believe in, you take baby steps with certain people, but you always try. You never say, I'm not even going to try. I always believe that you never know. You try, and if it doesn't work, it may not work, but at least you can say you tried. As far as our police department, I must say that I am proud of the department. When the mission first came out, I don't think a lot of people were happy. And what I said to the chief, and I'll never forget it, I said, Chief, this is an opportunity for you to show the community what you do. And through all of his discussions, I've learned things I had never learned before. I know a lot of the police officers, and what I find so interesting over the 4 years that I have sat on the town board, we haven't seen complaints about police from the public, but we've seen complaints about police from police. So in terms of them being effective, and when they hire, I think hiring is probably one of the most important things, and it is very difficult. I think you've got to be interviewed by 8 people before you're even able to get to first base with the chief. And what the chief says in those interviews with those different people, we're going to catch you. If there's something that we need to know, we're going to catch, one of us will catch it. Because he said that's the most important part of what we do, is picking an officer. I've read a portion of the report. I am concerned more about what the police department wants, and that was my call to County Legislator Smith in terms of a mobile crisis unit, because they go out, in fact, for over the last 2 weeks, they've gone out on 3 different calls for mental health, and they were difficult calls. So I tend to think that maybe it's the pandemic that's causing this rash of breakdowns, but I tend to think that they would like to have somebody that they could talk to, who could talk with that person. I know oftentimes it's not possible. I think one of our police officers was injured in answering one of these calls. I am just grateful that I came here tonight to listen, to get educated. And I was very happy to hear that people want a mural in Yorktown, because I think that's great. I don't know what more you want me to say other than that I'm happy there is this community group in Yorktown. I think it's important. And I think over the next several years, as we come back to normal, get back to normal, it will be important, because I think that my community, yes, it's a good community, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done there.
I agree. One last, we're getting close here. We have a question here from, I think everybody will know who did it after I read it. If we want to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in Yorktown, we need to pay attention to what is happening with housing development in Yorktown, and particularly with the overlay zones being proposed. And I believe we should, have a 10% affordable housing requirement in the new overlay zones. And the writer also suggested we maybe should have Norma Drummond, who is the County Commissioner of Housing, to come and talk to us and to other people who want to support affordability in all those wonderful new developments that are happening here in Yorktown.
Do you want me to respond? I know that's from Ken. And I agree. And I think that we will have another work session on this proposed overlay district next week. And I did get your memo, and I think probably every member of the board got it. And since nobody else will bring it up, I will bring it up next week.
Right. Right.
And you must bring it up as well, because you know what? Sometimes it's better than when just one person talks about it.
Hey, Mike, do you see any other questions that we haven't even addressed? Because it's tough to go through the chat and try to see. We can have one more question, and maybe then we can all
Yeah,
retire.
there is one comment from a Pace University graduate thanking Colin and Mayo specifically for their connection to Pace. I know Rachel had brought up DJ Henry earlier, and I know that was a significant event in the community. As a graduate of Pace, a member of the Athletic Alumni Club, and a former football player, I know all too well about how these incidents can really affect communities. I think the last question that we had, Mel, was regarding working with and dealing with members of our community that may not attend a seminar such as this because they don't feel racism exists in their community. I did see that there was a question on that. I think before we get to that, though, I do want to ask Diana Quast if she wants to speak about her time here, and we thank her for participating as well. So Diana, do you have anything before we ask this final question?
I'm just going to say thank you very much for letting me sit in tonight. I listened to a lot, I learned a lot, and I've sat in on many of our coalition meetings also. I've listened to members of our community and how they feel. And I think that working together is what's important. And I hope that you contact me because I'd love to work together with all of you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. So, I don't know if this might be, if Tejash, you want to start on this and the work you do with the Human Rights Commission, but, for individuals and groups that, don't really understand the magnitude of how these types of, discriminatory practices affect our community, what is a good way for individuals and organizations to, educate their fellow community on, one, that, things like this exist, and two, they need to work to make it better?
That's a very good question. And because you will meet people who don't believe that racism exists today. And I'm in a lot of those conversations. So I just share two things because sometimes it's helpful for that individual to get some data, or because they're not going to believe my opinion. They may want something else. So and the two examples I use are from housing. And I use an example that Long Island newspaper Newsday just did. They did a 3-year study. And I don't know if the group is familiar with it. And maybe when the Fair Housing Director comes in April, he'll talk about it too. But at a time when print publications are dying, Newsday did a 3-year study that talked about testing of prospective purchasers in Long Island and to see where they would get steered. It's improper for a broker to racially steer somebody. So they can't tell me, Tejash, you're better to live in Mount Vernon. And then a Caucasian prospective buyer with the same education, same background, and same qualifications, oh, you'd be better to live in Scarsdale. And what they found was the racially steering is violative of the human rights law and also the Federal Fair Housing Act, that 49% of African-American testers in that study were racially steered. Slightly smaller number of Hispanic and Asian testers were also racially steered. There is a phenomenal documentary that they have on their website. I'll put it in the chat. It's 45 minutes. They show you the discrimination. It is one of the areas where the tester said, I had no idea I was being discriminated against until I saw the testing of what the other people were showed. And so that's not from 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. That's from like last year or from 2 years ago. And as a result of that study, there have been a lot of changes in Albany with regard to regulations involving real estate brokers and some other professionals as well. So I think that is helpful for people to see. And one of the things, we live in a very litigious time. People are very quick to sue. When you have a study like that, they have not had a single lawsuit or a single claim because the entire study was videoed. So all the interactions with the real estate brokers were on video, so people could see them. I think that is it may be a helpful piece for people to see what happens today. But Long Island is a suburb of New York City. We're a suburb of New York City, and it would also show us how segregated the communities are, and that's when it's talking about testing the divide, and it shows you the divide. Second one is it's also a fair housing example. It talks about, and I think the majority leader Andrea Stewart Cousins talks a little bit about this, is when her father returned from World War II with a Purple Heart, he came to America and he did not get any housing assistance like his white colleagues in the military did, who got low-income loans to buy a home. And there was an American history of redlining in this country. It was a federal program, and that federal program still results in inequities today. If you look at one study that said the average wealth of a Black family was the median net worth was around $17,000. For an average white family, I think the median net wealth was $170,000. Our generational impacts, where an individual or a group of people were able to buy homes in the 1940s and 1950s at low income rates, and African Americans were unable to do so. And those impacts are still felt today. And by the way, when somebody tells me, hey, Tejash, racism was 400 years ago, slavery was 400 years ago, my family didn't do that, I shouldn't really have to think about it. I say, look, I was born a couple of years after the Fair Housing Act was passed. So just a few years before I was born, it was legal to discriminate against somebody in a fair housing in a context. So I think those are some things I talk about. And then there are obviously much longer conversations. You're not going to convince somebody been in a one-off, but if you show them these things, you're not believing my opinion. You're not hearing it.
That's right.
This is some data. And there's this phenomenal book that's right here. If anybody wants to read, it's called The Color of Law. This is a phenomenal book, and it talks about the history of redlining and housing policies in our country. And the author, Richard Rothstein, recently spoke at PACE at one of its land use programs. And if you Google Richard Rothstein, Color of Law, you'll get a video interview with him. But I highly recommend everybody read this book.
Okay, that's our not summer reading, spring reading.
Can I just piggyback on that briefly?
Sure, real quickly, because I want to do one other person.
Okay. So I just want to say, and thank you for that, Tejash. I think it's important for me at least. It's important to remember, we're talking about this whole concept of, people saying there's not racism, or it was 400 years ago, or whatever. And yes, that's true. There's plenty of people out there today that don't believe racism exists, or they believe it exists, but certainly not the way perhaps most of the members on this conversation do. And for one reason or another, and yes, I am sometimes, kind of stunned or baffled when someone says, "Oh, really? That's been going on." But I think we should remember, and this is sort of my approach to dealing with people, that for whatever reason, right? People are where they are at with any particular belief or worldview or ideology. There's some people who you will be able to make some headway with. There's some who you'll be able to make less, and then there's some who you're gonna at some point realize it's probably not worth your time. Maybe someone else will have a better chance at it. But taking people where you find them has always been, in my experience, one of the better ways to move along some of these conversations. And just because somebody who's your age, or in your background ethnically or religiously, or maybe even younger, or your demo, whatever, just because they are not at the same, do not have the same, viewpoint, or have not sort of arrived at the same place that you have with regard to some of these issues, doesn't mean that they can't be. And it can be, important to find out, from my view at least, why do they think this way? Half of my family supports Donald Trump still, right? Like a lot of his supporters. Some of them I try to avoid as much as possible, but I can't avoid all of them. They're my family members. I have to see them around from time to time. And I have to have conversations with them about some tough issues, which at times is not very pleasant. But I try and always keep in mind that people are where they are for however they ended up there, or whatever process or whatever stage they're in. And trying to meet people where they're at, while not always successful, in my view, has generally been it's allowed me to make headway sometimes when I didn't think it might not otherwise be possible.
Thank you. I just noticed somebody who, our former supervisor here in Yorktown, said, can I have a moment to make a comment? And I want to open it to Lonnie, if he's still on.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Mel. And Alice, the town is going to miss you very much when you step away from the board. But again, we won't miss you because you're going to be involved, as you said, in organizations like this. So I want to thank you for, let me be one of the first people to thank you for your service to the town for all these years. Aside from that, another comment, I think it's on Amazon Prime, but what that show, What the Constitution Means to Me, I believe it's on Amazon Prime right now. So if anyone is interested, it is excellent. But lastly, I haven't read the what ultimately came out of the coalition yet, but I did sit down on a number of the meetings and observe. And as a former judge, someone who was involved in the criminal justice system for 35 years and well aware of its deficiencies, it is a great system if it worked perfectly, but it has incredible deficiencies. And aware of that, one of the things that was raised at the coalition meetings was, I believe, a request, even it may have been from this group, for community oversight, an oversight committee. And I think that was rejected sort of out of hand, saying we have such a wonderful police force, it's not necessary. And we have such wonderful members of the town board who act as police commissioners, it's not necessary that people can go to the town board. My concern is I have every faith, and I don't want to speak disparagingly of anyone, but I certainly would have had faith if Alice continued on the board, that you could go to her without fear of retribution or repercussion to report an incident. I would hope that would be the case with all the board members, but I'm not sure that is the case with all the board members. And I think that, I'm not saying that we needed community oversight. I think we do have a wonderful police force. I think that the force, but we have to be ever vigilant of the potential of racism, because it does exist in this town. And we have to make sure, one thing I would have suggested is I helped create the mental health and drug courts in the Bronx over the years that I was there. And one of the things that were required when we had our focus groups and meetings in creating those courts was having individuals come in and teach us cultural diversity. I don't know whether that was discussed at the coalition. I don't think I ever heard any cultural diversity being suggested, but I think that is a huge component. And at least that way, people culturally react to police in different ways. And I think that our officers should be trained in that regard. And I think that's something also that we should keep in mind. That said, I think that, again, this group, I don't believe it has a political agenda. I think it has a moral agenda or an ethical agenda, and I applaud you for it. So thank you for your work, and I hope to continue on now in the in local government. I'm not going to say anything further other than that, and I hope that I can do my best to serve the town as best we can in that regard. So thank you, and I hope to continue on with your group, and if invited, I would love to participate as well.
Well, I think we've had a great evening, and people have stayed mostly. So I hope everybody listens to some of the things. I hope this is just the first step. I had said, I think that the county task force is going to continue. I think that they said, no, it's not broken up, it's going to continue. And maybe that's something we need to explore with the town, whether there be another committee that looks at these issues ongoing. But anyway, it's been a great evening. I thank everybody for joining us. I thank the speakers and members of the community. Great job, everybody.
Thank you to you, Mel. You did a wonderful job of coordinating this and putting everything together. So a great thank you to Mel Tansman, who's a great member of our community, who continues to do great work. So thank you, Mel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mel.
Mike, I would like to just mention, I've seen stuff that you've been doing on Facebook recently with, is that the over tipping? Is that your group?
Yeah, the Over Tippers Club. We collect funds to give to restaurant workers who have been, another part of, working to create more equity in our community. Restaurant workers who are disproportionately, minority, immigrant, etc. But more importantly, members of our community that deserve help in a time when help is sorely needed. Yep.
Right.
So we raise money for that. So keep watching out for that. We were able to raise up, upwards of $200 for certain restaurants in Yorktown to give as tips. So we're very excited about that. And as a credit union employee, I know all about the issues that our society has with, financial equity and the things that we need to do for better financial inclusion. So, just one of the many things that as a member of the community, we all try and do together to help. And that's really the goal at the end of the day.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. I know we could probably talk till midnight, but I think I've reached my limit. So
Good night, everyone. Thank you for
Night,
having
Mel.
us.
Thank you so much for
Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
That's the final word.